So we're going to do a breakdown of Harley Weir's work, but her portfolio is so varied and so interesting. And obviously she photographs models and still life and personal projects and self-portraits, but I'm going to focus on the studio side of things because there's lots of elements that I can teach and we can learn from. Primarily this idea of sunlight, window light, soft diffuse daylight coming through. But we're going to look at how you can do that on a limited budget because I think that's really helpful. A place where you don't need a massive editorial studio with guaranteed daylight or a bunch of Aries sitting outside a window. So hopefully you'll follow the exercise all the way through. And then I do a breakdown of a shoot that she did for Self-Service magazine, which is issue number 43 in 2015. But it's a really nice editorial. It's a big editorial. I recommend you have a look at it. So all the elements will come together for this final setup. There's a lot of work of hers that I can't really show because YouTube would censor the video, but I really recommend it. Her website's under construction at the minute as of filming, but if you're not familiar with her work, go and have a look at it because there's a vast amount of it out there and it's brilliant and beautiful. And if you're new to the channel, I do breakdowns that give you an idea of a direction that you could go in to emulate some of the lighting that you'll see in the photographer's work. And it's never a case of this is exactly what the photographer does to get to the end result. And I try and keep things fairly simple if I can. And also realistic on the idea that if you're learning at this point, you won't necessarily have a huge budget that some of these photographers are able to work with. Like and subscribe, all that kind of thing will be great. I might set up like a buy me a coffee or something thing because these videos take me forever and I need some kind of sponsorship. But I keep going as I can. So let's get to it. Okay, so let's have a look at the studio. 10 meters wide, 7 meters high, 7 meters long. We're not going to use all of that space, but I just wanted something that was quite big and would be similar to an editorial shooting space. And looking at Harley's work, a lot of that subtle warm light is coming in from the side. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to start with placing our light at the side with the head on a stand. Look at it from overhead. It's about 45 degrees from the model. So 0, 90, 45-ish, maybe a bit less. Power 6.3, and it's just throwing a big spread of light. If I turn the studio light right down for a second, you can look at what the actual spread of that light is doing, the big shadow on the wall. Let's bring the studio light back up. Studio light is just the sort of ambient light that would be in the room, just allows you to see what's happening. And again, back from overhead, the little arc of the light here, everything that we'd expect. But this is going to be our kind of warm, glowy sort of sunlight that's coming in. And the first thing that we would do with that is put a warming gel on. I'm going to use a different number of gels through this, but we're going to start with a full CT orange. Power's on 6.3 still. I don't have any grid, it's just an open reflector. It's going to be super contrasty, it's going to put hard shadows on the face, but we don't need to worry about that because we're going to bring other lights in. Look at that kind of warmth of that light, the two together, warming the background, warming everything because it's the only light in the image. And that really intense shadow on the nose, really hard edge to it. Next thing we want to do is try and control that light. So we're going to put a black polyboard in here. We've used black polyboards a lot. I've talked about them a lot for shaping, for negative fill. Really what we're trying to do is just block some of that light. And we're putting it in between the light and the model. So the model now has gone to a complete silhouette with the light behind. The light is just hitting that back wall. From overhead, we'd expect this fairly crisp shadow. But what we want to do is try and create something that's a little bit more natural and looks reminiscent of light coming in through a window. The next stage, we're going to light the model. So we want to get rid of that really intense shadow that's on the face and to begin to even things out. And because the model is essentially in the dark created by the negative fill of the black polyboard, we can just decide any light that we want to put in. So I've gone for a large octa. The reason I've gone for 135 is I would like a good spread of light that's across the body, but also I want the light to be really quite soft. The larger the light source, in theory, the softer that light is going to be. And I've got internal and external diffusers, so we're just putting it through 2 layers of diffusion. So again, it's softer on the face. I have also got a full CT orange, because at this point, I just want to match the lighting sources. I don't want it to look too separate from the background. And now instead of that hard edge shadow across the nose, we've got a softer edge shadow. The light is still directional. The reason I put the light from that side and still I'm okay with the shadow is I want it to feel like it's connected to the background light. We want to give a sense that that light that's coming in through the window is also the light that's hitting the model, but we're going to separate those two out a little bit later. But if I was, say, coming with the model light from the other side, it would look really artificial. And the thing with Harley's imagery is that all the light seems really well connected. It looks natural. It looks a lot of the time like it is just soft light coming through a window, or that her studio shots look like they're outside. And again, we're lighting from above because we also want to mimic that idea that it's sunlight. That's good, but also we know that's more flattering on the face. The next thing we're going to do is put another light from the other side to knock out some of that shadow, give a better reading across the image, and just essentially create like a 3D form. And I've chosen a different light source. I've got a parabolic, I'm not sure if I've talked a lot about parabolics. I can do a video about the qualities of those, but I want to play the light sources off against each other. I want something that's a bit more crispy, specular. I don't want to go super soft. And then the other thing I've done, I've put a color gel on. So I've gone for a dark orange. I want some separation between the colors, but again, I want to give that feeling that maybe it's like sunset. I want it to be fairly believable, but I don't want to put that strongest color coming from the window light. I think it would be too overwhelming for what we're trying to do with the picture. And let's just recap on the powers. So I've got 7, 6.3, and 6.4. The Octa obviously is doing the most of the work for lighting up the body and the face. I didn't talk at this point about the camera settings, so let's just have a look. I'm on a 50mm lens that will stay the same all the way through this. Shutter speed 250th, ISO 100, aperture f4. And normally I work around f8 in the studio, or advise people to work around f8. But the reason for f4 is I want to create separation between that background. I want to give that sort of filmic feel, mimic that idea of if I'm shooting outside and it's soft, low light, sunrise, sunset, naturally you'd be opening up the aperture at that point to get the exposure you want. So I'm going to kind of mimic something like that in the studio. And when it's just a plain background, it's not so obvious, but it will give a nicer quality. And just look at the relationship with the lights there. So we're pushing in the main light from one side, and then we're just filling in the light from the other side. But let's also just take the gels off so we can see the difference between the gelled and the ungelled light. Compare these side by side and the real impact those gels make. Let's look at the image on the right for a second. It doesn't feel like there's any gradient to the background, but with the gelled light, you are really noticing a subtle gradient. The difference between the color and the tone, top left to top right of the image, is pretty significant. So again, using the gels will be really helpful. You don't have to gel all of the lights, but we're trying to create some sense of harmony within the picture, which is a big part of Harley's imagery. So if we're happy with those 3 lights, now we need to refine them. The easiest way to do that is bring in the second polyboard, and this is going to act as our window light or gradient light, and we're pushing the light through this gap. And it's a little misleading what we're seeing on the preview image as opposed to what we'll see on the final image, because we're feathering the light through that gap. We're not going to get a really hard edge to the shadow because of the relative distance between the polyboards and the light and the background. I'll show you how that changes a little bit later if you're confused by that. So we're just pushing this light through the gap. Let me just turn it to a solo, that strong silhouette form, but now we've got this slightly feathered effect on the background, which is a smoother fall off on the left hand side of the image and kind of a little bit harder on the right. So like the light is pushing through something, pushing through a window. There are ways to more clearly define this as a window light. And again, I'll show you that a little bit later on, but I really want to show what you can do with just the simple resources you might have available. And polyboards we know are cheap and easy, and every studio has them. So from the top, just pushing through that gap, everything else stays the same. Let's take that off that solo light. Let's compare it with single polyboard and a double polyboard. Notice also how we read the front of the image differently when there's a gradient feel to the background. The exposure has not changed on the model, but there's a slightly different sense of emphasis. And also your eye doesn't leave the frame. If you look at the image on the left, when you're kind of reading that image, your eye would drift out of the frame because there's sort of nothing holding you in. With this image, that gradient feel is kind of stopping you leaving the edge of the frame. And we're going to look at these ones from overhead now because there's little differences happening. And let's just watch the gap between the polyboards. This may be a better way to see it. Just changing that gap, narrowing it down so we can feather the edge a bit more, or bring the shadow a bit more towards the model. Small adjustments will make quite big changes. If we look at those side by side. This image on the right is where we've just moved that polyboard in just a couple of inches, but obviously because it's throwing a big shadow, it makes a big difference on that background of the wall. Feels like there's a little bit more kind of harmony here. I prefer the positioning of this, but again, this is where you would then need to begin to play around in the studio. And I just move it back out now because I also want to put it as a bare bulb. Bare bulb can be quite nice to use in the studio, depending on the studio height, the ceiling height, the walls. Bare bulb can throw around a lot of bounce light, so actually sometimes it can be softer in some of the shadow fill, but it will give a kind of fairly hard light if it's actually hitting the model as well. So you can get different effects with this. Let me just show you these two. So this is the reflector and this is the bare bulb. The important thing to notice, you're getting a crisper edge to the bare bulb. Now that may be something you like. It may be more defined, like, oh, it's a window light, rather than a soft gradient feel. So I'm just showing you how you can affect those changes by having different modifiers or no modifier at all. And we're angling the light up, obviously, with a bare bulb. Power on that is still 6.3. So essentially all we've done is just taken a reflector off. Next, what we want to do is just have more control over the gradient and the feathering effect. So let me flick between these two. So this is the reflector as normal. and the reflector again, but we've changed the position of the polyboard, and we've got this fairly narrow gap between the polyboards. And if we compare these two, you'll be able to notice by pulling that flag of that polyboard all the way back, we've lost that harder edge to the shadow on the far side. There is still a minimal gradient, but you won't notice it as much. But I'd like to really get control over that gradient. I'm going to bring that poly really close to the wall. If we just spin around from the top, it's important obviously that we don't overlap the polyboards. There is still some light that can kind of penetrate through that gap, but we're just making that controllable gradient on the wall. Everything else is staying the same. This is our first image that we were happy with. On the right hand side is when the polyboard is really close to the wall. So we can really control how much of that light is hitting the wall, but also how defined the edge is, the shadow edge, whether it's a feathered edge, whether it's a really hard edge, and also where we really sit that kind of highlight or that sunlight that is behind the model. The other thing that we could do to get a little bit more control over this, because this is a big white studio space, now we know we've got fairly soft controllable light from the front. It's not super high power, it's not really high contrast, so there's not a huge amount of light bouncing around. But again, that black drape on the floor will control things just a little bit. It's great if you want to have a lot more control over contrast and shadows. See that from above. Very simple. So we've got something that we can control the background quite significantly with. Let's just have a look at those all together. And I call that light that's coming in from the side the window light. So we know if we put more power into that, we'll begin to kind of bleach out that background and we'll get more intense. And we'll also get a more clear difference between the light and the shade. So there'll be a bigger kind of contrast factor here. We also know if we really widen or narrow the gap, we can get real different edge and softness of the feel. And if we push that polyboard, as we've got in this shot right now, if we push that polyboard closer to the wall, we're going to get a really clearly defined shadow, softening things off a little bit with that black negative fill. So we've got a controllable background light, but we can also do something a little bit different, and we could have a softer light that's coming in from the side, and we can control that spread. So what I've got here is just a simple diffusion panel. It's like a third stop diffusion, 2 meter by 2 meter. So a lot of the light is going to pass through, but we're creating a bigger light source. So I've got my light head here with the reflector on it. I've put it almost to full power, and I put a dark amber. I could also just flick it to red so you can see where all of that light's coming from. Put it back onto amber again. And essentially what we're doing is we're lighting up the whole of that big 2 meter by 2 meter surface. And as the light is pushing through there and also bouncing around the space, it's beginning to kind of fill the frame with light. So the background has almost completely changed. We don't get that nice soft window light feel, but we could also get like a dawn light, for example. We could get more separation by putting more power into the model light, but just showing you that you could throw light across that wall and get the idea that a colored light is flooding into the space. The other thing that we could do with this is push a little bit of both past. So with this one, let's see from overhead, the light is pushing directly into that diffusion panel. And this one, I've moved the light over, so it's kind of clipping a little bit half and half. Now we can vary the angle of this so that we're getting some of that main light fall onto the background. I'll just cheat the angle on this to show you what I mean. So we're opening this up. Now we're pushing that light a little bit through the diffusion and a bit past the diffusion. We're getting a gradient on the background again. This was the light going into the diffusion completely, and then on the right, the light clipping past the diffusion on one side. Big difference in terms of the gradient there. Let's put that on a red so we can also see exactly what that light is that's coming in. Put it on a flame red here. Apply that change. And the two side by side, the gradient feel from a light to dark across the image. This gives a sense that there's a window light coming through here. Now we'd need to adjust the gels that go onto the model. There's too much of the same color that's happening right now to get separation, but we know we could do that really easily because we know how we can control those model lights. I'm just going to put something on here so we can have a quick look at it. Let's put like a jade on here because it's sort of working on the opposite side in terms of the color spectrum. Put a marine blue. Go crazy here. Compare those two side by side. Really easy to see the difference. We're getting a lot of color from that diffusion panel. It's coloring a lot of the image, and then we're trying to knock that back a little bit by our octalight that's coming in from the front, and then our parabolic that's coming from the side. And we're seeing those crispy blue-green highlights on the skin. We're getting a sense of direction of the light coming from this side and coming across here. We're getting that sort of little highlight that's hitting on the eyes, cheekbones, and on the chest. Again, once you get the balance of colors that you want to work with, then you'll see how that picks up really nicely. And in post-production, we could really emphasize that difference. But for me, my preference would be to move away from that diffusion panel. Although I do like this idea of kind of clipping across, I prefer putting the light directly through the black polyboards. So we're going to go back to that now, and we're just going to work a little bit on then defining what that light could be and getting a more soft or subtle light onto the model. Look from above. I've gone back to the setup where I've got this black polyboard much closer to the wall. I've got this one opened up here, so I've got this feathering effect on the light. Let's put this as a solo. We can see exactly what's happening here. A little bit of the light is catching the model, but but nothing that's too distracting. And then we'll put the side light back on as our solo again. We know that's toning the rest of the image, but mainly it's about pushing that light into the side of the model's face from the parabolic. And then we can just work on what the light is to the actual model. All we're doing is we're taking this really soft light, which already has an internal and external diffusion, and I'm pushing it through a half-stop diffusion panel here, 2 meter by 2 meter. I'm going to put this as a solo light. The things to be aware of when you're putting it through a big diffusion panel, some of the light will bounce off that diffusion panel. And what you don't want to do is knock out everything you've done in terms of a kind of a delicate light source by throwing light that's bouncing around the space again. And you'll be able to see that, like if you look at the background preview image on the right, if I move this up and down, you can see a lot of light is kind of flooding through the space now, and I'm beginning to kind of block some of that light out. So you have to be a bit careful when you put big diffusion panels in that you're not knocking out the subtlety, but it's nice to get that softness of the light on the model's face. The other thing that we could also do with this is we can make a slightly smaller octa and a smaller diffusion panel, so we're aware that it's just kind of hitting the top half of the model and it's not spreading around the rest of the frame too much. It's not hitting the background. We could also put some kind of flag at the top, so also that stops it from hitting the background. But I'm trying to introduce setups that don't require a huge amount of rigging, because that gets kind of slow, sometimes expensive, sometimes you need more people to do those things for you. Obviously this could be on a ceiling rig or it could be on a stand. Take that back off the solo light and look at the image again. So we'll compare it with the black negative fill on the floor. You see that on the overhead one, we've got the octa, and then the lights are the same, the polyboard position is also the same, and then this one we've just added that diffusion in. And look at the difference with the light on the model's face here and here. Again, no right or wrong. It's about how much you want the light to hit the model, how much separation you want. I could look at this and say, actually, there's not enough light on the model's face here, although I like how soft it is. I've got a half-stop diffusion on that panel right now. I could change that to like a third stop, so more light is going to pass through. That will be one solution. And let's also look at this background light again. On this image, I've got 7.5 power of the light that's going through the two polyboards. So this light that's hitting the backdrop, 7.5, and on this side, I've got 8. Again, it's just about how you read the image, the dominant part of the image. What is your eye drawn to? Is it drawn to the subject? Is it drawn to the light that's streaming through the background? You could put a deeper color onto it and get more of a sunset feel. You could take out the gel, for example, on the octa, so less colored light is also hitting the model. See that on the preview image. And so again, there's a little bit more separation between the model and the background. It's also worth looking at what that does with the skin. I've changed the model's outfit on here. It's just a little easier to see, because actually on the model image on the left, it's hard to see where that colored tone light is hitting the arms, for example. But you can really see it quite nicely on the skin. It's a really soft light. Picking your gels, you can tone that clip light that's coming in. All the light sits together quite nicely. There's no light that's super high contrast. There's a softness all the way through the image. And then it's just about changing the ratio slightly. Maybe you want more light onto the model's face, or maybe you want to turn the light down a little bit onto the background. Just about how you balance those things together. A lot of Harley's images are really about what that tonal quality is, the balance between the highlight and the shadow. That highlight that comes in is often really subtle, and it's kind of like when the sunlight is really dropping and it's just those last moments of sunset. Then the other thing I want to show you also is how we could feather that background a little bit more. So let's look from the top again. It's a setup that we're fairly happy with. All I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a second polyboard. So I've got a staggered polyboard here, and it's just a bit of an overlap from one side. And what I'm trying to do with that is create a feathering background, so there's a bit more of a gradient between the two. See them side by side. This is the single polyboard on one side, and then I've got that double polyboard now. So again, I'm changing the emphasis. Your eye maybe doesn't come out the edge of the frame quite as quickly in this one as it does on the image on the left. You also read the difference between this value and this value differently than you do on the other side. So then you kind of concentrate on the model a little bit more in the picture, because you're sort of boxing someone in, but also the contrast values are slightly different again. And just to be clear on what I've got with that, I've just got this second polyboard, staggered it a little bit further away, and then it's clipping it out on one side. Now I'm going to keep that feathered polyboard in, and I'm going to change the gel of the light that's coming in. That's our sunlight light. So I've gone for a flame red now, because I want a warmer feel coming in from that sort of sunlight than I've got in the rest of the image. And just so we're clear what we've changed, I've got the CTO orange on my octa, but then I've got flame red coming from the sunlight side, the window light, so that color has more saturation to it. And then from the parabolic I'm punching in, I've got a dark orange. And let's compare those two images, because there's quite a big difference now. Image on the left, everything was the same, the feather poly, the overlap, and then everything stays the same apart from on the image on the right, that window light has the flame red, and it sort of ties everything together. Flame red seems like it's a really strong color to put in, but when I'm pushing extra light onto that background, everything sits in a register that seems to be quite natural. This color across the highlight area, that window light, fits with the color that's on the model's skin. So you sort of read the image with more harmony, looks more realistic. So we've got a lot of control over our image and how we read the image. Next thing we could do is say, well, we really want to control exactly what that window light is. And a classic way to do that would be to have some kind of gobo. So some kind of cutout that you're passing the light through. I click on this, I show you what I mean. So we've got a gobo mask here. Loads of different variations. You can buy lots of different cutouts, but essentially you're pushing a light almost like through a stencil, as if you would with like a projector. So I've already got a classic 4-panel window. Most of the stencil is kind of hidden because I'm hitting the polyboard with it. Obviously you can change the zoom and the angle of a gobo so you can get a more pronounced stencil. You can also change the focus of it as well so it's really sharp or it's less defined. But right now we're just pushing this single arc of light through, clipping it with the polyboards, and we're getting this clip light onto the background. Look at a preview image with that. And this is not correct right now, but this is just to show you the difference. So we've got the warm light, and then we put this projected gobo light in. Because it's very strong right now, and the power on this is 8.4, and it's like a concentrated little light source, and it's just hitting here. It's knocked some of the color out of the image, but this is our way to get this really clearly defined shape. We can also refine that and make that a lot more like a window light, which we'll do now. Let's look at that as overhead. So we're still keeping the stencil the same, but now we're changing the position of these polyboards. So we're pulling them both back, widening that gap, narrowing the beam of the gobo projector, so now we can see this defined window light on the background. We're pushing right through this gap, very clear outline on the wall of light and shade. See those 4 stages together: feathered poly, warm light, gobo raw essentially, and then gobo is a window light. And position of this, we've got it up high, we've got it on 5.4 power. Obviously the power that you would put through the gobo depends totally on what light you've got. A gobo is normally an attachment that you'll put on some other kind of head. You don't necessarily need the same power as you would through an octa, for example. They're great to play around with. The distance really makes a huge difference, obviously, and then the zoom factor. Let's look at that on its own. Got this hazy kind of feel, not super defined hard edge, looks a bit like a window. Got this nice gradient across the image, but also we've got this color shift that's happening in the image. This looks closer to light that's bouncing in through a window and it's bouncing back onto the model. Maybe there's a second window over here that's where the rest of the sun is kind of coming. We've got this warmer sunset feel. And if we look at them side by side, I've toned the gobo light with the gel. Also, I've got a similar gel to what I have with the parabolic. So I've gone for dark amber here, and that gives us the balance between the two, makes it a little bit more realistic and believable. If I had a dark amber on here, this would be too similar to the light that's coming through here. It wouldn't necessarily look like it's bounce light or light that's coming back in from another window. Compare it without the gobo and with the gobo. Everything is the same in this image as it is here, apart from we've got the gobo in. So we've got this slightly less red light that's coming through the window. Everything sits in a more believable register. The other thing we could also look at is maybe we want more light onto the face now, just to pull the face out a little bit and make it a little bit more interesting, or maybe that's like the story that we're trying to tell. So all I've done here is I've just put another reflector in, 7 power. I put a number 1 grid on it, so we know that narrows down the beam of light. And then just to get the colors in a similar register and not make it look like it's totally working against the feel of the picture. So everything else had like a full CT orange, or it had a dark orange or a dark amber. So I want to put something fairly similar for that front light. Look at those side by side. And we're just pushing that light into the face. The reflector is contrasty. We know that it's fairly open front with a grid into it. So it's going to put a stronger shadow under the chin. It's going to give us some of those kind of specular highlights a little bit because of that silver of the reflector. And again, we could vary this. We could bring the power down so it sits a little bit more in this register. Like we take it down to like 6.5 and it would just sit back a little bit. 7.5 brings the face forward. I could put a tighter grid on so it's much more just about the face, or I could have the grid quite open like it is on a number 1, so it's all about the model in the frame. Just gets that separation. Again, it's about balancing what you want to do. Now that we've got everything we're happy with and we understand like the basics of that, we'll try and refine one of these images from Harley's shoot for self-service. This image of the model on the ladder. I want to keep the lighting setup the same and then just tweak things. So we're using the same principles. Just throw the model onto this weird ladder here, get a rough pose. So we're comparing this image without the front face light and this image. So you can see nothing's changed at this point. Just put the model in. The camera position has changed slightly in terms of the height. All the lights are the same. And already it's pretty similar to the image that we've got as a reference. I just changed the outfit so we can see the skin tone also, because that's kind of important in her story. Obviously her model is lighter skinned than I'm using in this demonstration. And let's look at those lights separately. It's the same as it was before, but it's good to see what actually is happening with this. So we've got that octa that's pushing down. It's a subtle amount of light. It's not a huge amount of light that's hitting the model. It's just allowing us to kind of read the image. Some of the light's falling onto the background, but we know we're going to knock that out a little bit later. Then we've got this clip light that's pushing in. I've got an internal and external diffusion because I want to soften that light that's pushing in. I've still got the same gel on. See in the preview image, it's shaping. There's some nice like texture and tone on the legs, so that's great. A window light is a solo. We don't want it to hit the model at this point. We just got that silhouette and we've got that nice window feel. And then this is the image that we're throwing our warmth into the rest of the picture. She doesn't have this in her image, but we want to keep that setup the same so I can just show you what you can really control. But we need to get more of a crisp highlight from the top, which is what is in her image. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the gel of the octa over the top. 8.6 the same, but without the gel. That knocks a lot of that color off. Compare those two. You can really see how that gel was toning a lot of the image now from the octa. What I also want to do is get similar to how she had, so there's a colorama in the background, so we're going to put a colorama in, and I've chosen a coffee because it's similar, I think, to what she's got in the image. Let's compare the difference of those two. So no colorama, that's onto a white wall. You see the real big difference with the colorama in. It just holds everything together. Now what we need to do is put a bit more light into here, so we could change the power of the octa. I'm going to move that octa forward, take out the diffusion panel. The other thing I'm doing is when I'm taking out that diffusion panel, I'm putting a slightly smaller octa on. I had a 135 and now I've got a 120. I had the internal and external diffusion, but now I'm putting a grid. Look at the preview image on the side, moving it in, increasing that power. It just puts all that really nice crisp highlight down the model's body, but also it's still a soft light and it's really controllable. Compare those two side by side. And we're getting something really quite close now to the image from the editorial. Crisp highlights across the body, nice highlight on the face and hair. We could put more power into this if we really want to go as far as she has with the image, but obviously there's no clothes at this point, so we're just like showing the skin tone. And that kind of brings everything together, but the principle is still the same. We're pushing feathered light through the polyboards. We've got our gobo projector giving us a window light if we need that. We could take it out and we'd still get that feathered light feeling across the background. We're pushing in our parabolic from one side to define the body, and then we've got our overhead octa that's giving that really nice highlight. If we want to control a little bit further, and now we're like super skilled in the studio, so we know how we could do that, let's go overhead. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this light away, that is our feathering light, because we've got the projector doing that. We don't have loads of lights in this rental, we've got small budget. I'm going to move that light round to the side, take the gel off it, and it's going to push into the model, and it's going to give that accent light. Compare those two side by side. I've taken out the red color. Obviously that was the red gel that was that hard reflector. I've brought the hard reflector around to this side and I'm pushing that edge highlight in. I still got that window light feel. If I wanted to give more color tone to the image, I could put a stronger color gel onto the parabolic. But again, I'm defining the shape of the model. As always, no right or wrong with this, just showing you how you can control contrast, shape the body, get color into the imagery. Now, if I look at that and say, well, that highlight is too unnatural, it doesn't look like warm sunlight, for example, that's coming in, all I need to do is gel that light that's pushing into the model's body, which we will do on this one. And I'm just putting a dark amber, and I've reduced the strength of the color gel that's coming in from here. Originally, I think this was dark orange, right? And so now I've got like a half CT orange, shifting that color dominance through the frame. And we see all three of those. And suddenly this one again looks more like sunlight that's coming through a window, because I've taken the color out from this side and pushed the color dominance back into this side. This one we had color light moving across the body, color light pushing in, and the color window light, but we had no color light over the top. This one has the dominant light that's coming in from the right hand side. And suddenly it looks like window light again. And it's a really simple setup. We're not using a huge amount of space. We're using like 3/4 of the width of the studio, not the full depth of the studio at all, and we're definitely not using the height of the studio. Really controllable, something that you could do fairly easily with 4 lights if you have that. You could also do it with 3 lights. Also, if you don't have the gobo projector, no, you can just push a light through these polyboards, you know, also get that kind of slanty light across the background. So you don't need a big daylight studio or shooting at a certain time of day to get that window light feel. It's super controllable. You can shoot 8 hours like this and still have that real sunlight field. Again, hope it was useful. Once you start to see this in some of Harley Weir's work, you'll notice it in lots of places. But like I said, it's really subtle, the amount of highlight that's pushing in, what that strength of that color is. She does lots of other really exciting things with her work as well, but it's just one aspect that I think could be really interesting to work with. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.